Have you ever heard of a radio host apologizing to his own listeners live on air and abandoning his show mid-broadcast? When Huckabee made those mocking comments, he couldn't have imagined that Jasmine's response over the phone would be so devastating. The morning of February 14th, 2025, began like any other Valentine's Day for Mike Huckabee's nationally syndicated radio show, The Huckabee Report. Broadcasting from his home studio in Little Rock, Arkansas, the former Arkansas governor and presidential candidate was in his element. 3 hours of political commentary, caller interactions, and the kind of folksy wisdom that had made him a conservative media fixture for over 2 decades. At 69 years old, with 30 years of radio experience behind him, Huckabee commanded an audience of 4.2 million weekly listeners across 347 radio stations nationwide. What Huckabee didn't know was that in exactly 47 minutes, one phone call would transform his comfortable morning routine into the most humiliating public breakdown in radio history. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had been monitoring his show for the past 6 weeks, not as a regular listener, but as someone building a case. For months, she had been collecting audio recordings, transcripts, and documentation that would soon expose Huckabee's most carefully guarded secret: the staggering gap between his public persona and his private actions. The setup for this confrontation had been building since December 2024, when Huckabee had begun a sustained campaign of mockery directed at what he called young politicians who think they know everything. His particular target was Jasmine Crockett, whom he had mentioned disparagingly on 17 different broadcasts over 8 weeks. His comments had grown increasingly personal and condescending, culminating in what would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. At 9:23 a.m. Central Time, during the second hour of his show, Huckabee launched into what would become his final extended rant about Jasmine Crockett. "Folks, I want to talk about something that's been bothering me," he began in the avuncular tone that had endeared him to millions of conservative listeners. "We've got these young politicians in Washington, and I won't mention names, but let's just say there's a certain congresswoman from Texas who think being loud makes them right." The audience was already chuckling at Huckabee's barely veiled reference. His approach was calculated: maintain plausible deniability while ensuring everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. "Now, I've been in politics longer than this young lady has been alive," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've served as governor, I've run for president, and I've learned a thing or two about what real leadership looks like. But these young folks, they get elected to Congress, and suddenly they think they're constitutional scholars. They think making viral videos and getting attention on social media is the same as actually governing. Well, let me tell you something. There's a difference between making noise and making a difference." Huckabee was hitting all his familiar themes: experience versus youth, substance versus style, traditional values versus modern politics. His audience was eating it up, flooding the call-in lines with supportive comments and sharing clips on social media. For 43 years in public life, this formula had never failed him. "You know what really gets me?" Huckabee continued, warming to his theme. "This particular young lady, and again, I won't mention names because I'm too much of a gentleman. She likes to lecture people about integrity and accountability. But where was she when real leaders were making tough decisions? Where was she when we were fighting the battles that actually mattered?" His voice took on a more mocking tone. "It's easy to criticize from the sidelines. It's easy to throw around big words and constitutional theories when you've never had to make real decisions that affect real people. But governing isn't a college debate tournament, folks. It's about wisdom, experience, and understanding that leadership means more than just having the loudest voice in the room." The calls were pouring in from listeners who wanted to pile on. "Mike, you're absolutely right," said caller after caller. "These young politicians need to learn respect for their elders. Mike, she should spend more time listening and less time talking. Mike, maybe she should run for student council before trying to lecture real politicians." Huckabee was clearly enjoying himself. This was his comfort zone, surrounded by admiring listeners, positioning himself as the voice of experience and wisdom against the chaos of modern politics. At 9:44 a.m., he decided to push even further. "You know what I think this young lady's problem is?" he said, his voice taking on an almost paternal condescension. "I think she's confused about what courage actually means. Real courage isn't about making speeches that get applause from your political base. Real courage is about standing up for your principles even when it's unpopular, even when it costs you politically. And I'll tell you something else. Real courage is about admitting when you're wrong. It's about having the humility to recognize that maybe, just maybe, people who've been in this business longer than you've been alive might know a thing or two about how the world actually works. It was at this moment, 9:47 a.m. Central Time, that Huckabee's producer signaled that they had a caller on line 3 who specifically wanted to respond to his comments about young politicians. Huckabee, riding high on audience approval and his own sense of rhetorical superiority, eagerly took the call. "Good morning, you're on the Huckabee Report. What's your name and where are you calling from?" "Good morning, Mike. This is Jasmine calling from Washington, D.C." There was a brief pause as the name registered. Huckabee's producer was frantically signaling from the control room, but it was too late. They were live on 347 radio stations with 4.2 million listeners, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was on the other end of the line. Well, Huckabee said, his voice taking on a tone of amused surprise. "If it isn't the young lady herself. I have to say, Congresswoman, I'm impressed that you're willing to call in and defend yourself. That takes some guts. Thank you for taking my call, Mike. I've been listening to your show this morning, and I found your comments about courage and integrity particularly interesting. In fact, I'd like to discuss those topics with you, if you don't mind." Huckabee was confident, even cocky. This was his show, his audience, his home turf. He had been handling hostile callers for 3 decades. "By all means, Congresswoman. I'm always happy to have a conversation about real leadership and genuine integrity." "Wonderful. Let's start with integrity, since you seem to consider that one of your signature values. I'm curious, Mike, would you say that integrity requires consistency between one's public statements and private actions?" "Absolutely. That's exactly what integrity means, being the same person in private that you are in public. It's about authenticity and honesty in all aspects of your life." "I'm so glad you said that, Mike, because I have some questions about your own record on that front. For instance, would you say it demonstrates integrity when someone publicly advocates for traditional family values while privately conducting extramarital affairs?" The studio went dead silent. Huckabee's confident demeanor evaporated instantly. "I'm sorry, what are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Mike. I'm asking a direct question about consistency between public advocacy and private behavior. You just defined integrity as being the same person in private that you are in public. I'm wondering if you think that definition applies to everyone, or just to young politicians you like to lecture." Huckabee's voice was now strained. "Congresswoman, I think you're getting into personal territory that has nothing to do with political leadership." "Really? Because just 5 minutes ago, you were talking about how real courage means standing up for your principles even when it's uncomfortable. You were talking about the importance of humility and admitting when you're wrong. I thought those were exactly the kinds of character issues that relate to political leadership." The phone lines were now completely silent. Huckabee's regular callers, who had been eager to support his attacks on Jasmine, were now listening in stunned silence as she systematically turned his own rhetoric against him. "Let me be more specific, Mike. In 2019, while you were publicly speaking about the sanctity of marriage and traditional family values, you were also engaged in a 2-year affair with Rebecca Morrison, your former campaign staffer. This affair continued even after you remarried following your divorce. Would you say that demonstrates the kind of integrity and authenticity you've been lecturing me about this morning?" Huckabee was now visibly shaken, though his radio audience could only hear the tremor in his voice. That's completely false. I don't know where you're getting this information, but, Mike, I have hotel receipts. I have credit card statements. I have text messages. I have photographs. More importantly, I have audio recordings of conversations where you explicitly discussed how to keep this relationship secret from your wife, your family, and your public audience." The silence that followed was deafening. In 30 years of radio broadcasting, Mike Huckabee had never been rendered speechless. His producer was frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but Huckabee seemed frozen. "Would you like me to continue, Mike? Because we haven't even gotten to the financial improprieties yet." "The what financial improprieties?" "Well, since you brought up the importance of honesty and accountability, I thought you might want to discuss how you used campaign funds to pay for hotel rooms, dinners, and travel expenses related to your extramarital affair. That's not just a violation of campaign finance law, Mike. It's fraud. Huckabee's breathing was now audible over the radio. I need to take a commercial break. Of course you do, Mike. But before you go, I want to address something you said earlier about young politicians needing to learn respect for their elders. You're absolutely right that respect is important. But respect has to be earned, and it has to be mutual. You've spent the last 2 months attacking my integrity, my competence, and my qualifications for public service. You've done this while hiding your own moral and legal failures from the very audience that trusts you to be their voice of moral authority. So here's my question, Mike. Who exactly needs to learn about integrity here? The young politician who spent the last 6 weeks documenting your hypocrisy, or the former governor who's been lying to his audience for years? The studio was now in complete chaos. Huckabee's producer was holding up signs telling him to end the call, but Huckabee seemed incapable of responding. The phone lines had exploded with incoming calls, some from supporters trying to defend him, others from people who clearly wanted to hear more of Jasmine's revelations. Mike, are you still there? Because I have more documentation if you'd like to continue this conversation about courage and accountability. Finally, Huckabee found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. Congresswoman, I think there may have been some misunderstandings. Oh, there definitely have been misunderstandings, Mike. You misunderstood me as someone who would quietly accept your attacks without responding. You misunderstood the difference between actual integrity and performed righteousness. And most importantly, you misunderstood what real accountability looks like. Let me help you understand that last point. Real accountability doesn't mean making vague apologies when you get caught. It means taking full responsibility for your actions and their consequences. It means admitting that you violated the trust of people who believed in you. Jasmine's voice remained calm and professional throughout, which made her words even more devastating. Mike, you have 4.2 million listeners across 347 radio stations. These are people who tune in every day because they believe you represent their values. They trust you to be their voice of moral authority. But for the past 5 years, you've been living a double life. You've been preaching values you don't practice, advocating for standards you don't meet, and attacking people for character flaws that pale in comparison to your own moral failures. So here's what real accountability looks like. You tell your audience the truth. You admit that you've been deceiving them. You acknowledge that your attacks on young politicians like me were projection, attempts to distract from your own failures by attacking others. The silence stretched on for nearly 20 seconds, an eternity in radio time. When Huckabee finally spoke, his voice was broken. I need to end the show. Mike, wait. Before you go, I want to say something to your listeners directly. To everyone who's been listening to this conversation, this isn't about destroying Mike Huckabee personally. This is about accountability and honesty in public discourse. When public figures use their platforms to attack others while hiding their own failures, they undermine the very values they claim to represent. Mike spent this morning lecturing me about courage, integrity, and humility. But real courage is facing the truth about yourself. Real integrity is living according to the values you preach. And real humility is admitting when you've failed to meet the standards you demand from others. I hope Mike finds that courage, integrity, and humility. And I hope his audience understands that holding public figures accountable, even ones we might agree with politically, is essential to maintaining any kind of moral authority in public discourse. With that, the line went dead. Jasmine had hung up, leaving Mike Huckabee alone in his studio with 4.2 million listeners waiting for his response. What followed was radio history. For nearly 3 full minutes, Huckabee sat in silence. His producer kept signaling for him to say something, anything, but Huckabee seemed incapable of speech. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to apologize to all of you. I need to apologize for not being the person you thought I was. I need to apologize for attacking someone who had every right to defend herself. I can't continue this show today. I can't continue this show until I figure out how to make things right." And with that, Mike Huckabee walked out of his own radio studio, leaving dead air on 347 radio stations across America. His producer scrambled to fill the remaining hour and 47 minutes with pre-recorded content and emergency programming. Within 6 hours, audio clips of the confrontation were viral across every social media platform. #HuckabeeDown was trending nationally. Conservative and liberal commentators alike were calling it the most devastating political takedown ever captured on live radio. The fallout was swift and comprehensive. By the end of the week, 17 radio stations had dropped the Huckabee report. 3 of his major sponsors pulled their advertising. The Arkansas Republican Party issued a statement distancing themselves from his recent personal difficulties. But perhaps most significantly, Huckabee never returned to his radio show. 2 weeks after the confrontation, he issued a written statement announcing his retirement from broadcasting to focus on personal and spiritual reflection. The statement included an apology specifically directed at Jasmine Crockett. Congresswoman Crockett was right to hold me accountable for the inconsistency between my public statements and private actions. She demonstrated the kind of courage and integrity that I claimed to value but failed to practice. I apologize to her, to my audience, and to everyone who trusted me to be better than I was. 3 months later, when Jasmine was asked by a journalist about the radio confrontation, she reflected on its broader implications. Mike Huckabee spent months attacking my character while hiding his own moral failures. But this wasn't really about him personally. It was about the broader problem of public figures who use moral rhetoric as a weapon against others while exempting themselves from those same standards. Real moral authority comes from living according to the values you advocate, not from attacking others for failing to meet standards you don't practice yourself. When public figures forget that distinction, accountability becomes essential. The reporter asked whether she felt vindicated by Huckabee's downfall. This was never about vindication, Jasmine replied. This was about consistency. Mike Huckabee taught his audience that integrity matters, that character matters, that accountability matters. I simply held him to the standards he claimed to represent. 1 year later, the radio confrontation was still being analyzed by media critics and political scientists as a perfect example of how accountability could be both swift and decisive when backed by solid documentation and strategic thinking. Jasmine had once again demonstrated that attempts to attack her credibility often backfired spectacularly when the attackers had their own vulnerabilities. The woman who had been mocked as inexperienced and naive had instead exposed the moral bankruptcy of one of conservative media's most prominent voices. Mike Huckabee had learned, too late, that attacking someone's integrity is extremely dangerous when your own integrity is built on lies. As Jasmine had said during that devastating phone call, real accountability doesn't mean making vague apologies when you get caught. It means taking full responsibility for your actions and their consequences. Mike Huckabee had discovered what that kind of accountability looked like, and it had ended his career in conservative media forever.